religious system which the world will swallow hook, line, and sinker and worship the Antichrist as the Messiah. They'll reject Jesus but accept the Antichrist. Second, he will bring the world into wealth, and the world will love him and respect him and worship him because he has brought them into wealth. Beginning in Revelation 19 and verse 1, the Bible tells us, or Revelation 18, verse 1, the Bible tells us that another angel came. Look at this. After this, Revelation 18:1 in our text today, after this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. John says this is another chapter. This is something new. This is not like the previous thing I just saw. This is another angel. This is different from the previous chapter about the great prostitute, the tribulation. This is something else. Another angel comes. He has great authority, and he illuminates the very earth with his splendor. His illumination is more powerful than the very sun itself. I want you to understand something, and that's that some angels are more powerful than others, just as some demons are more powerful than others. I'll give you an illustration. Jesus took in the book of Matthew, Peter, James, and John up to a high mountain, and Jesus was there transfigured before them. You remember the story of the transfiguration, right? And on the way down the mountain, the disciples saw a very large crowd around the other disciples that they'd left at the base of the mountain. When they reached the other disciples, they discovered that a man had recently brought his demon-possessed son to the disciples, but they could not cast the demon out of the boy. So when Jesus got down, he came to the base of the mountain, he came to the crowd, he came into the crowd, he discovered the situation, and Jesus immediately cast the demon out of the boy, although all of the other disciples who'd been left behind could not do it, although they all tried. So Jesus did it. Later on, as they were alone, the disciples asked Jesus why they could not cast the demon out of the boy. And Jesus said this, "This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting." I want you to understand that not all angels and not all demons have the exact same power. Some are more powerful than others. So imagine the scene, if you will. This is the very end of the time of tribulation. This is the very moment just before Jesus returns, and another angel, a new chapter opens, another angel comes down out of heaven. He's so powerful and so awesome and so amazing that he is brighter than the sun, and he illuminates the entire earth with his presence. It's almost like he's saying, now that I have your attention, can you imagine? The whole earth is illuminated by this angel that comes down from heaven. The whole earth, obviously, my mic's scratching. I don't know what's wrong with it, but pay no attention. So anyway, you can imagine the whole earth looks up, and it's like, now that I have your attention, earth, I have something to say. Go back to our text, Revelation 18. Look at verse 2. With a mighty voice he shouted. I mean, can you just imagine? Here this angel comes down from heaven. He's brighter than the sun. He illuminates the entire earth with his presence. And then he shouts with a voice that travels around the circumference of the entire globe. Think about that. And he says this. I mean, if he were to say anything, what would he say? He says this. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She's become a home for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. He goes on, he says, for all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. I believe this. I believe that as we close into the end times, that you may begin to see some rumblings of Babylon being rebuilt. It's very possible that those have begun now. It's possible that Babylon will be rebuilt near its ancient site. We don't really know, but there will be a city, I believe, that will be built. a massive, amazing city of worldwide trade. A city in countries that are very wealthy. A city with an amazing seaport, because it talks about that later in chapter 18. We're going to see that. Babylon is the city that will control the worldwide economic system that the Antichrist will use to stand on one of his two legs, therefore bringing wealth into the world, controlling the world, seducing the world, deceiving the world into following him. The Bible tells us that Babylon will become a place of spiritual evil. Babylon will become a place of seduction and a place of greed. I don't know if you've ever heard any excerpts of Anton LaVey speaking or not, but he claims to be a priest of Satan. He started the first church of Satan in California. He is a devil worshiper. And he says in some of the tenets of his faith, so to speak, if you could call it that, we believe in greed. One of the tenets of people who worship Satan is greed. They call it one of their virtues, I guess. The world will be transfixed upon greed during the time of the Antichrist. And the Antichrist will fulfill their passion for greed. The angel comes and he says, Babylon is fallen. Why? Because of her sin. Because she's influenced and continues to influence the world to sin. And they traded Jesus for money. What does the Bible say? The Bible says that you cannot worship God and money at the same time. They traded souls. They actually traded their own souls for the temporary pleasures of this world, and they licked their lips in greed. They drank of the wine. They drank of the spirit. They became mad. They became insane with it. They became controlled by greed. They wanted just a little bit more. When I was a teenager, when I was in high school, my mother worked for a very, very wealthy woman. My mother was a nurse, and during those days they didn't have the visiting nurse services they have today, but if you were wealthy enough, you could hire private nurses. And my mother had 3 boys at home, if you can imagine, and I was really the best kid of all. I never caused any trouble. I was perfect in every way. And so Mom took this job as a private nurse because she wanted to be home a little bit more because she had 3 boys at home. And she wanted to keep her eye on them, if you can imagine. I don't know why she would do that. But anyway, she took this job as a private nurse, working for this very, very wealthy woman. She lived on East Avenue in Rochester, just down the street from the George Eastman House. You know, right in the neighborhoods where these gigantic mansions are. And she had one of the gigantic mansions on the street. It was built for them as a wedding present in 1929 at the height of the Depression. His parents or her parents, I can't remember which, they both came from extremely wealthy families. They built them a mansion for a wedding present. It had 4-car garage, it had servants' quarters, it had more bathrooms than you could count. You know, it was just one of those amazing mansion kind of places. And it sat on almost 2 acres of cultivated gardens. And so in the summer, this very wealthy woman would allow the teenage boys who worked from the private nurses that came in, that worked for her, to work in her gardens. And she had a gardener. She had this wonderful old man who was a gardener, and he taught me a lot about gardening, by the way. But anyway, I worked there for many, many summers when I was a teenager in her gardens. I'd clean out her bird baths, and she loved to watch the birds, and we'd paint her fence, we'd paint the barn, we'd hoe the gardens out. She had these huge rose beds. You know, we took care of all the roses. I learned how to take care of roses. It was kind of neat. But I learned some stuff when I worked for her. She was a fascinating woman. She was an interesting woman. She, all of her life, wanted children. I mean, the one thing that she wanted more than anything else in the whole world was children. And I found out through people who'd worked for her that was the thing she wanted more than anything else in the world. And her mother-in-law would come to her house on a regular basis and would pat her tummy